right, Proverbs 21. And in as much as we are doing rough sketches of the chapter this week, or at least a little bit rougher sketches than usual, let's call this one Sketches and subtitle it Compass in this chapter, where it reminded me that trying to live life according to our own moral compass can get pretty confusing pretty quick. And that's probably on the good end, because the longer we are able to live life according to our own moral compass, the more messes we can sometimes make. And this chapter reminded me in a time when, once again, it's talking about God at least 5 times, or at least that concept of the Lord will come up 5 times as we've seen it in previous chapters. It also comes up in combination with the concept of the king, but the king is going to seem to come up only once in this chapter. 9 times the Proverbs are going to give us wisdom regarding money. 12 times, going back to that dominant theme of righteousness, it's going to seem to talk about righteousness again, 12 times. Wisdom is likewise going to be a theme in this chapter, but only 3 times did I see it specifically come up as words of wisdom, or wisdom in the way that we speak is going to be 3 times mentioned here. Once again, a recurring theme, but not quite as much as the theme of righteousness, which pointed me back to that whole concept of our own moral compass, when a very famous, or a rather famous verse kind of brought that to mind, when in verse 2 it's going to say, every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. As verse 3 is going to go on to say, to do righteousness and justice is more acceptable to the Lord than sacrifice. A theme it's going to pick up towards the end, when it's going to say in verse 27, the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. How much more when he brings it with evil intent? Going back to that whole concept in verse 2, that every way of a person or a man is right in his own eyes. The thing that frightens me most are the times when I think I might be bringing a sacrifice to God with healthy motives, when he is, as it says in verse 2, weighing my heart only to find out that I come up wanting. I'm really doing it for an ill purpose. Which reminds me that these things don't tend to happen overnight, because there is another proverb that we've already talked about that mentions there is a way that seems right to us, but the end of that path or that way is death. And so these proverbs seem to be reminding us of something we will see again in the prophet Jeremiah, who talks about the way in which our hearts can be deceptive above all things. Understanding that whether or not people believe in the Bible, most people believe that hypocrisy is wrong. And hypocrisy can be one of those things that is super difficult to see when I am stuck in doing things my way. Stuck in that way so much sometimes that it can be difficult to pull back and see whether or not that way looks right from a different perspective. Most importantly, God's perspective. Which reminds me of a time in Israel's history where it seems that each individual had the freedom to guide themselves by their own moral compass, as the book of Judges will remind us in chapter 17, roundabout verse 6. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Pointing forward to the very last verse of the entire book, where in Judges 21, verse 25, it will likewise say, in those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. Understanding that the larger context of the book of Judges tells a story of the time in Israel when everyone got so used to doing their own thing that the entire nation became little better, or possibly no better, than Sodom and Gomorrah, 2 societies that God destroyed. And even though Israel survived their Sodom and Gomorrah phase for this period of time, the prophet Ezekiel will point back to Sodom and Gomorrah as a reference point for what Israel had become at the time God eventually takes them away into captivity. And really not even Israel, but Judah, understanding that by the time Ezekiel prophesies using Sodom and Gomorrah as a reference, he's only using it as a reference for the kingdom of Judah, understanding that the northern 10 tribes had already been taken into captivity. This portion of the Proverbs seeming to be a kind of midpoint between Israel's Sodom and Gomorrah period under the Judges and the divided nation, Judah's Sodom and Gomorrah period before its final deportation into captivity. This chapter in some ways seeming to remind us that, as appealing as our own individual moral compasses may seem, it's easy to lose track of the ways in which my moral compass and your moral compass are actually driving the conflict we see around us. Which is why we often say God's best to you as you go forward in Him, understanding that our moral compasses are individually meaningless unless we fundamentally are first treating people the way we want to be treated. And beyond that, diligently seeking for Him to help us understand what that actually looked like in the lives of His servants in the past, so that moving forward, we may likewise be diligent to live our lives according to a healthy moral compass.